This is the morning brief from the Economic Times.
Great Indian Bustard
is the government who I hold more responsible. Great Indian Bustard of extinction, economic development,
ongoing battle between economic development and the preservation of nature.
Did you know that the Great Indian Bustard and not the peacock was to be the national bird of India? The GIB and the peacock are both big birds, but while sightings of peacocks are common today, the GIB has gone almost extinct. There's fewer than 150 of them out in the wild. Yes, you heard that right, fewer than 150. While hunting the bird is banned, the species now faces a new danger: green energy. These birds run the risk of colliding and flying into power transmission lines that crisscross their fragile habitat. The Supreme Court of India stepped in. It has ruled that transmission lines now have to be moved underground to give the GIB a fighting chance. But the power companies are up in arms, saying it's easier said than done. It's the future of an entire species versus billions of dollars of corporate investment that hang in the balance, and there are no clear winners. I'm Nehal Chaliawala, and you are listening to The Morning Brief. In today's episode, we discuss if India is indeed no country for big birds.
The bird that loves to walk more than fly. One that epitomizes life in a seemingly hostile landscape. Today, it is critically endangered, torn between its ecological needs and our development, threatening to walk into extinction, quite possibly in just the next few years.
To understand more about the GIB and the complex reasons which have led to its near extinction, we have with us Dr. Abi Vanak. He is a senior fellow at Ashoka Trust for research in ecology and the environment.
So the Great Indian Bustard is an iconic species in India. It has an interesting history. It was at one point of time proposed to be the national bird of India by none other than the great Dr. Salim Ali, known as the Birdman of India. It at one point of time was found across the states of Rajasthan, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, and even as far down as Tamil Nadu. It's a large bird. Okay, it's one of the heaviest flying birds in India. It depends on grasslands for its breeding activities. Okay, it lays a single egg a year. So unfortunately for the GIB, because the grasslands were not considered important for conservation, slowly, especially starting from the 60s and 70s onwards, when irrigated agriculture became a big thing, along with the Green Revolution and so on. All across central India, large dams were being built that would allow for areas that were in the dry region to now have irrigated agriculture. So that meant that the grasslands slowly vanished, and along with it, the foraging areas of GIB started going away. Mm-hmm. There was no protection for the species, so there was some hunting. And, a combination of all these factors led to the GIB going extinct from more than 90% of its former range.
So what's the state of the GIB right now? In which regions are they left in India, and what are their numbers, and how grave is the situation for the species?
So now the last stronghold is in Rajasthan. And even there, the bird is embattled. It's fighting unfortunately a losing battle for its life.
How harmful are the power projects in Rajasthan for the species?
So, on top of all the other reasons that have caused destruction of the bustard habitat across its range, ironically now green energy projects, so-called green energy projects, the renewable energy projects of solar and wind farms, are going to be the final nail in the coffin for the protection of the Great Indian Bustard. But it's these power transmission lines that are crisscrossing GIB habitat, mm-hmm. which is posing to be sort of the real killer here, with GIBs colliding against them and dying.
There have been suggestions of using preventive measures like bird deflectors and line markers to prevent collisions of the birds with the power transmission lines. Can you tell us what these options are, how they work, and are they effective?
The studies that have already been done show that these may not be as effective for bustards as they may be for other species of birds, such as cranes or eagles. And this has to do with how bustard eyes are placed on their heads. So bustards have side vision a lot more than they have front vision. Okay, so when they are flying, they don't actually see some of these things that's in front of them. So the Supreme Court has recently ordered that all power lines in bustard habitat should be put underground. And I think that's what we should be looking at. There's no economic argument that holds validity anymore. This is the future of a species that is, in jeopardy because of our actions. And I don't see any argument. There's no valid argument, basically.
To understand more about the Supreme Court ruling and what is at stake for companies involved in this standoff, I reached out to my colleague Shashwat Mohanty. Shashwat has been reporting on this case since the very beginning. Shashwat, can you tell us what exactly the Supreme Court ruling is in this case?
Hi, Neil. Thanks for having me on. To understand the Supreme Court ruling, we have to go a little further back to December 2020, when the National Green Tribunal, or the NGT, had directed the center and states to install bird diverters on all existing power lines within 4 months. New projects were also to have this, as well as old projects. Now, the companies didn't like this decision, because they thought it was unnecessary. This case was appealed in Supreme Court and was argued on the basis of feasibility. Now, the case moved from bird diverters, which are highly reflective sort of pieces, which are attached on transmission lines to give the birds a sort of view from way back that, do not enter through this. So they kind of choose an upper or lower path in their flight. This moved to undergrounding of transmission lines, which basically included digging up land and including the transmission lines underground instead of having overhead wires as we are used to. In India, such a thing has only been done in South Bombay, where offices and residential areas in posh localities like Nariman Point and Colaba were willing to offset the cost because it was important to them. But in April, when the Supreme Court decision was reached, the bench was headed by ex-Chief Justice S.A. Bobde. He's a well-known flora and fauna lover. So he, in turn, included an even larger area for these companies to have their undergrounded wires in, saying that, the courts, in the court, the defendants were arguing on the basis of, and I quote, difficult but not impossibility. They're saying that it's an expensive procedure, there'll be a lot of process involved, but they never said that it was impossible. So yeah, that is where we are at now from the April Supreme Court decision.
So Shashwat, how big of a parcel of land is involved right now?
So the Wildlife Institute of India, which came out with this report, has demarcated this into two very specific areas. They include just parts of northern Gujarat and a huge part of the Thar Desert in western Rajasthan. So for the first part is priority area, which is 13,000 square kilometers. This part is where the Great Indian Bustard is known to have its migratory path and sometimes even habitat. There is another much larger area which is demarcated as the potential area, which goes up in excess of 78,500 square kilometers. Now, the Supreme Court's April ruling includes even the potential area, whereas previous rulings only included the small priority areas.
Can you tell us how many projects will be impacted because of this ruling?
So earlier in the priority area, mostly wind projects would have been affected. These are, the pioneers of renewable energy projects in India. So all of these priority area wind projects were constructed pre-2004. The new projects which are coming up are done by companies such as Adani Green, which is the conglomerate's renewable energy arm. However, when you expand this talk to potential area, every single renewable energy country currently operating in the country will be under the scanner. It includes companies such as Hero Future Energies, which is again Hero's renewable energy arm, Tata Renewables, which is Tata's green power arm, Greenco, Avada, O2, and including also Renew Power, which is now slated to be listed at NASDAQ. So virtually every single company will be affected in this judgment if the potential area goes through.
Also, Shashwat, can you tell us what will be the economical impact of this whole exercise?
So Nehal, if as we've put this, right, priority area is 13,000 square kilometers, whereas potential is 78,500 kilometers. Now, within the 78,000 figure, we also include a place called the Bhadla Solar Park, which is the world's biggest solar park. This is a sort of a special zone in which only renewable energy projects can be constructed. Now, the West Rajasthan area is really great for solar projects because of A, very easy availability of land, and B, it gets at least 300 days of sunshine a year, which is really important for these projects. Now, cost-wise, if we talk about it, I've reviewed an MNRE document which pegs the overhead cost, the normal transmission lines laying at 75 lakhs a kilometer. Whereas if you go and underground the same lines, the cost for that is 28.8 crores. So developers have estimated the total cost from overheading to undergrounding would be pegged at somewhere around $3 billion or 22,000 crores, which would in turn require a tariff hike of 10 to 15%. So currently our solar projects are bid out at a range of around 2 rupees, 2 rupees 10, 2 rupees 20 paise per unit. But these will go up 10 to 15% if these changes come in place.
The renewable energy companies in the region say that they are just as concerned about the survival of the GIB as all of us.
See, to begin with, in the same lines with what was discussed during the hearings in Supreme Court and the stakeholders, it is not always about the cost of it. And everyone in the stakeholder community is equally sensitive about GIB, and we are ready to take any step that can stop GIB from extinction.
That's Subrahmanyam Pulipaka, CEO of the National Solar Energy Federation of India. NSEFI is an industry body that represents the interests of the solar energy companies in the region. These companies say that there is a need to look at the solution with new eyes.
So we have tried to get access to information about bird mitigation, bird collision mitigation studies and measures that have been adopted in many countries. By and large, if you look at, if you take an example of Spain, where the same bustard family was their Great Bustard family, there the mitigation measure was ground wire marking with the colored PVC spirals. This was resulting in almost 61 to 65% decrease in the collision frequency, and the mortality rate also significantly decreased, and the risk posed to the birds also significantly decreased. So the presence of this flight diverters with color marking and all was seen to be working there. When we look at Scotland, similarly for this bird called white stork, they used line marking and route planning to avoid areas or to sort of highlight the areas where birds are highly prevalent, and this also decreased the collisions by almost 94%. So this was a very significant case study. So the last conclusion here I would like to give here is that any sufficiently large form of marker, which we have seen from these studies, which thickens the appearance of the line at that point by at least 20 centimeter and placed in sufficient regularity on either the ground wire or the conductor, is likely to lower the collision by at least 60%, at most 90%. So these are just some of the findings that we have gathered from the international case studies. We are trying to see how these can be implemented, or what kind of affirmative action can we take to immediately prevent the collision of GIBs.
Right. What would be the ideal solution to this conflict from the power company's perspective?
See, I would like to sort of modify your question. There is no acceptable solution from power company's perspective. There is only acceptable solution for everyone, because we believe, and contrary to the popular opinion, we have a strong resolve that we will not let GIBs die or get extincted in our watch. We will take every possible measure to ensure that their collision is mitigated. Having said that, the committee has been formed. The feasibility of the undergrounding lines is being explored. So there, in front of committee, if we are called, we will try to put forward the point of how undergrounding of high voltage lines, as echoed by Supreme Court, is not particularly feasible in Indian context. Technically, also environmentally, also undergrounding is the last resort in every of the case. So, if we can arrive at a solution where all possible measures that can be taken to mitigate GIBs can be in place, that will be something that will be happy or satisfactory to power companies and GIBs.
The current crisis reflects a larger and ongoing battle between economic development and the preservation of nature, which is not new. This is why we decided to take a look at the bigger picture, to understand if long-term resolution is something we can hope for. D Madhusudan, who co-founded the National Conservation Foundation, is now working as an independent ecologist and conservation scientist. He offers his take on these recurring conflicts. Madhusudan, large infrastructure projects like highways, power plants are considered critical for development, but they often come at the cost of conservation. Is this conundrum between development and conservation inevitable?
Yes, I think the overlap is inevitable. Whether such overlap inevitably ends up as conflict or not depends significantly on how we have conceptualized development, how we have conceptualized economic growth, industrialization, and on the other hand, how we have conceptualized conservation. So I think there are ways of doing this that can minimize the conflict and enable both, which I think are essential if the society has to move forward in a balanced manner. So I don't think conflict is inevitable, the overlap is inevitable.
What can be done at a point when conflict is unavoidable? Say like the example of the GIB.
I don't think conflict is unavoidable there. So the contestation is always in the nature of things. I do not think I can think of a situation in conservation that is above contestation. How that contestation gets resolved is really something that in a society with robust democratic debate and so on, these are things that can actually be discussed and resolved. Contestations are the lifeblood of the various perspectives that have to be brought in and reconciled in order to achieve this balance that I talked about. So I don't see contestation itself as a problem. I don't see contestation as conflict. When contestation is not managed well, I think that's what leads to a buildup of energies, some of which may not be of the right kind.
Madhu, how would you rate India's track record in handling these unavoidable conflicts? The legal remedies are there with the government, but still we find ourselves in this quandary. What different can be done by the government?
I think there's a lot that can be done. Foremost, I think the best time to deal with the contestation is when you anticipate it, not when you react to it. I think time and time again, we find ourselves in situations where we are reacting to conflicts and contestations rather than anticipating them. The way this can be anticipated, to give you the simple example of our protected areas, which are areas like our wildlife sanctuaries, our national parks, our tiger reserves, which are earmarked for the conservation of wildlife, of nature, of a whole diversity of habitats like mangroves and what have you. In these places, these are established under law. And what these designations as wildlife sanctuaries or national parks or tiger reserves give is a protection from other forms of use, from other claims. So I think to be able to know that there is a large tract of habitat that is going to be bisected when you place a large 8-line highway through a forest should not come as a surprise to us. So we are often attracting the sunk cost fallacy, where huge amounts of investment has been made, permissions have been obtained, funding has been raised, and then is where we encounter environmental regulation. But I think the smartest way to regulate is to anticipate the kind of projects and needs the country has, the ones that might actually end up being in conflict with the goals of conservation, and trying to think of ways by which this can be harmonized, in some cases through separation, in some cases by letting one override the other, and to be able to do that through a process that is inclusive, public, and transparent. That is where I think we can make a very big change.
Madhu, endangered species are protected by law even outside protected areas. But there are numerous examples of species being harmed by development projects which may not lie in the protected areas, but still they are being harmed. What is the recourse there?
That's a harder situation, but it's still not irremediable, because regardless of where a project is conceived and proposed, it still has to go through a certain set of environmental regulatory processes in which the question is invariably asked about whether a place where a project is being proposed is the site where an endangered species in Schedule 1, which is the highest level of protection we have under the Wildlife Protection Act. The species under Schedule 1 occurs in those areas. And I think very often this information, even when available, is not shared honestly. And often the hope is that by suppressing such information, you end up making it possible for one outcome over the other.
If we look today, environmental impact reports are more of a checkbox that projects need to tick before they can move on. Do we need a legal framework to be reworked here? How can we ensure that conservation is done proactively rather than reactively?
The biggest problem we have is that there is no project that is ever cleared, even within our, I would say, broken environment regulatory framework, where any proponent is permitted to conduct any project without any conditionality or without checks and balances. The problem is that these are never, ever revisited. I am not aware of places, at least within the wildlife protected area network, where permissions, once given with conditionality, have been revisited to audit the compliance with the conditions, where prosecutions of violations have been undertaken. I don't know of a single example where someone who's violated conditions that have been part of a project permission has ever been prosecuted. So when these are not done, one will end up creating an entire and large and elaborate system of meaningless rituals than in terms of putting something that is simple, robust, and achieves the ends of conservation without undermining development.
Like Madhusudan said, we need to rework and rethink policies ground up if we hope to arrive at long-term success. And we must hold our elected leaders responsible for lapses in wildlife conservation. But the Great Indian Bustard, unfortunately, may not have that much time left. Dr. Vanak, what's the future of the Great Indian Bustard like? Are we doing as a society enough right now to prevent the species from going extinct? How effective is captive breeding?
So unfortunately, we're not doing enough at all. We're not doing enough on multiple different lines. Look, captive breeding is seen as a silver bullet, but unfortunately it's not. Captive breeding is in fact the last resort. It's basically an admission of defeat. It's saying we can't ensure now that the population that's in the wild will continue to thrive in the wild and potentially recover. We haven't fixed the core problem.
That's all from us today. You've been listening to The Morning Brief, and I am Nehal Chiliawala. This episode was edited by Shashwat Mohanty. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. We look forward to your feedback. Write to us at themorningbrief@timesgroup.com. And if you like this episode, please share on your social media handles. We'll really appreciate that. The Morning Brief airs every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. Thank you for listening. And if you have made this far, I'd like to leave you with a thought from Madhusudan. Cheers.
The job of a corporation, the job of a profit-making corporation is to make profits, to return shareholder value. To do so in a manner that is just and fair to fellow citizens and to nature would be desirable, but it is not a requirement for you to be a corporation. It's not part of what you sign on to when you register to be a corporation. So to that extent, it would be great if corporate leadership involved these aspects, but that it did not is not something that bothers me greatly. But who I hold more responsible to ensure an outcome that is fairer, more transparent, and more just both towards people and towards the environment is the government. So it is the job of the government to harmonize competing claims and contestations over use of lands and waters and resources, including the future of species like the Great Indian Bustard. It is the job of the government to be able to come in and make a call on how much it values the remaining 150 individuals of a species that is on the brink of extinction, whether to lose a few hundred megawatts of renewable energy is too big a price to pay to be able to protect a species that is found nowhere else on Earth. I think this is exactly the government's job. In a situation where the government is only talking about growth, I would be terrified, because it is like riding in a vehicle that has only a more and a more powerful engine with no brakes. Our laws that ensure rights of people, our laws that ensure environmental regulation are meant to be reasonable brakes. Because if we don't want to be hurtling in a place and to land in a wreckage, the only way of doing this is not just to invest in engines wildly, but also to be able to invest just as much in having sound and working brakes.
Credits for all the external sound clips used in this episode have been mentioned in the episode description.